to the very far side of the cemetery. Where is it here? Is that it there? Yeah, I think that's it there, isn't it?
Which one are you looking?
It's the Welton lot.
Oh, the Welton, it's right over there. Right up, yeah, the last one. The one for
Yeah.
teachers. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Got it.
Okay,
You got it.
I got it. That's it. On the very far side of the cemetery is the Welton family tier. Wallace and Louisa Welton were teachers. Their daughters never married, and they also became teachers. Now, the stones on that family lot indicate two daughters, Lena and Jenny. But the local residents remember that there was actually three daughters, with the youngest of them being Mildred. Mildred was also a teacher. She also never married. After her parents and siblings had passed away, Mildred moved to New York to continue teaching, but we do not know exactly when Mildred passed away or if Mildred's remains were ever brought back to Tremont to be with her family or not. But the story I wanted to tell you about the Welton lot is because they were all teachers, for many years there used to be a school bell that sat on top of that headstone to acknowledge that they had been teachers. One year it was found to be hanging from a rope from a tree limb overhead, with the rope going off into the woods as though someone had used it to play a prank. Now, of course, over time that school bell disappeared. But it said, if you listen carefully, you can still hear a school bell ring. Okay. This headstone here on the east side of it is the headstone for our politician. This is the headstone for Alfred Parker Welton, who was an MLA for the County of Kings. And get my dates here. He was MLA from 1890 to 1894, and then he was on the municipal council for 20 years from 1895 to 1950. And it was a year before he passed away. He was our politician. And then come down a little further here. This is a headstone for Henry Parsons. Henry Parsons was a local carpenter, but he was also known as the local undertaker. He fashioned many of the caskets and rough boxes for those that were buried here in Tremont. Okay, I'll get you to follow me this way. And I'd like to introduce you to a war hero. This is the headstone for Edwin R. DeLong Burns. He served in World War I and he was actually killed overseas. He's buried in Belgium, but he's memorialized here in Tremont. His wife, Bertha, and their son are also on their family lot. Another important person I'd like to introduce you to is over here, again on the far side. We will walk by her a little later on this evening. But that's the headstone for Jessie Woodbury, RN. Little Jessie was a girl that was born and brought up in little old Tremont, and she went off to the big city of Boston to learn how to be a nurse. When she graduated from her training, she then went to Newfoundland and Labrador, where she worked for 2 years before returning to her native Nova Scotia. Once she was returned here, she became one of the main figures in establishing a cottage hospital on Bridge Street in Middleton, where she worked for 3 years before taking over as matron at the newly built Soldiers Memorial Hospital. Not bad for a little girl from Tremont. Okay, now some other people that I wanted to introduce you to here in the cemetery. They weren't as well known through who their family was, what their position was, or what their job was. They were just more ordinary people who lived ordinary lives. Now their lives had risks and hazards in them that we are not exposed to today, but for them it was an everyday occurrence. There's a headstone at the top of the hill up there, a tall spear, and that is the headstone for James Eklund. James Eklund worked at the Torbrook iron mines. On April 7th, 1894, there was an accident at the iron mines that took his life, and James was only 23 years old at the time. Okay, I'll get you to come this way. Do be careful of footstones. They are a tripping hazard. Like this one. Yeah. So this is a headstone for Jenny Sproul, who died on July 23rd, 1894. That's right. She was only 13 years old at the time. Her obituary doesn't indicate it, but living relatives have told us that the cause of her death, she had been kicked by a horse, and that's what resulted in her death. So again, that's a hazard that we're not necessarily exposed to on a daily basis. Now I've got a young lady over here that I'd really like to introduce you to, little Annie McGill. Kate, you want to come over here on this side of me? Okay. Okay, Annie McGill. She's on the headstone here. At the bottom it says Elizabeth A. McGill.
They've got a different stone.
It's the same stone. I cleaned it. And the cleaner that I use, it continues to clean over time. So it just gets rid of all the moss, and it's actually really brightened it up. It's done a beautiful job on it. Little Annie McGill loved to go to school. She just turned 7 years old, and in February of 1866, there was a storm day, and she wasn't able to go to school that day. But she was so anxious to learn something, she decided she was going to commit to memory a poem. So she did. And she went up to her mom and she said, "Ma, I learned something today even if I couldn't go to school." And then she recited her poem. "I am young, but I must die. In my grave I soon shall lie. Am I ready now to go, if the will of God be so?" Now I don't know if her mother was impressed with her memorization skills, but her mother sort of had a bad feeling about that poem, because even though Annie was seemingly in perfect health, Annie actually took sick that very night. And within a very short period of time, it became evident she was not going to survive her illness. She passed away on March 23rd at the age of 7 years, 1 month.
They I suppose it's known for the cause of death.
Her obituary doesn't indicate the cause. And a lot of times the doctors wouldn't really know what caused them. But anyway, this is the McGill stone that I mentioned earlier, where the stone itself has eroded away. And the only information we have is the initials that's on the footstone. So they're easier to read daily.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go straight back. I want to show you a really interesting stone that's in the Saunders lot. Again, be careful of the upright footstone and the different elevations in the ground. Okay, this is the headstone for David and Elizabeth Saunders. It's very obvious from this headstone that genealogy was extremely important to this family. They made a point of engraving numerous information on their headstone about where the family originated from, who they were related to, the fact that they were a descendant from a passenger that came across on the Mayflower, so on and so forth. And they were so particular about the information that there's actually an addendum on the back of the headstone to clarify that this Saunders family came from England and not Scotland. But that's actually not the stone that I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to introduce you to their son David. Now David had a most unfortunate mishap when he was in his teenage years. At the age of 16, David had gotten a job helping to bale hay, and he was riding in a hay wagon coming back from the farm. And as they were riding over the rough road, they hit a rather large bump, and David was thrown off the wagon. Now when David landed, he was impaled by not just one, but 2 pitchforks. He was grievously injured, and he was not expected to survive. But to the surprise of his doctors and nurses, he actually did somewhat recover from that accident. Over time, he eventually was able to sit up in a chair, and eventually he was able to walk with the assistance of a crutch. Now, the thing about David, and this is the story from his obituary, is that he was a rather industrious individual, and he didn't like just laying in a bed and not being able to do anything. So he decided he was going to take up needlepoint. And he perfected his needlepointing so much so that his work actually rivaled a lot of the community ladies' work. But David eventually succumbed to his injuries, and he died just before his 30th year. So he lived for about 14 years following that accident. So we're going to venture across the cemetery here. Be careful, we have a groundhog that keeps trying to make his way back in. So there is another hole dug. I had that covered 2 days ago.
Look, gotta be careful.
And we've got a slight elevation to come up over.